Evening and welcome. I am Terry Kay of the Jewish Grandparents Network, and we are thrilled that you joined us tonight. Thank you for being here. We are delighted and excited to welcome the renowned author, speaker, and podcast host, Mark Oppenheimer, guide us tonight in how to talk to our preteen and teen grandchildren about anti-Semitism. A very big thank you to Zoe Fleischer, our colleague from Tiny Windows Consulting, who is helping us facilitate with tech support. You'll see Zoe will add links and information in chat. And talking about chat, we would love to have your questions throughout. So please go ahead and write your questions in the chat box or raise your virtual hand. We want to hear from you. Now it is my great pleasure to turn the mic over to our dear friend and wonderful board member, Dr. Ron Wolfson, who will introduce Mark Oppenheimer. Ron is Fingerhut Professor of Education at American Jewish University in Los Angeles. He is the author of 17 books on Jewish life, and Ron is Ronnie to two delicious grandchildren named Ellie and Gabe. And Ron will also tell you that his power is in jeopardy right now. So over to you, Ron.
Thank you very much, Terry. Welcome, everybody. It's thrilling to have you join us at the Jewish Grandparents Network, one of my very favorite organizations. It's a pleasure to introduce our friend Mark Oppenheimer to the JGN crowd. His bio reads, I'm a father, a husband, a dog owner, and a challah baker, not necessarily in that order. But professionally, he writes outstanding columns and books. His latest, you may know, and if you don't know it, you should get a copy, Squirrel Hill, The Tree of Life Synagogue Shooting and the Soul of a Neighborhood, a powerful story of how anti-Semitism can become violent. His podcast, Unorthodox, is must listen to weekly hearing. Mark and I share a love of frozen treats. Mine is frozen yogurt, his is coffee ice cream. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you. Ron has saved the most important comment for last. Sort of after all the books, you'll end with the books, the degrees, the honorary titles, you'll end with the frozen yogurt. I want to play nice, but I feel like frozen yogurt is just, bad ice cream. I mean, I don't know. It's just ice cream that failed. It's junior varsity ice cream. But that's okay. That's okay. It's such an honor to be here. And I'm really, that I have been hearing from David Rayfield in particular about the Jewish Grandparents Network for several years now. So really since its founding. And I was impressed with the idea from the start, and I followed the work avidly. And I know that, the upwards of 100 of you who are already joined in, and probably more because I know some of you are watching as couples, are forming something that is very, very beautiful and very special. And I say that as somebody who was extremely close to my own grandparents and who sees the relationship that my children have to my parents and hope someday to be a grandparent as well. And I take the relationship very seriously. And in fact, it occurs to me just now as I say this, that I began my third book, which was a memoir about my years as a high school debater called Weisenheimer, with stories of my grandparents' house in Philadelphia in West Mount Airy, and how it was really their love of language and the spoken word that turned me into a talker and a writer and a music aficionado, and that it was the culture of my grandparents' house that was so influential to me. So I really, truly could go on all day about my grandparents, who are one of my favorite topics. But I want to talk about the subject at hand, which is a difficult one, but I also think one with tremendous opportunity for possibility and for humor and for generativeness and creativity, which is the role of grandparents in transmitting resilience and defiance of anti-Semitism. So I want to do that by tackling really three questions. The first is the state of anti-Semitism in America today and the world that we're in. And then the next two are going to be two strategies that I think grandparents can be particularly effective in deploying in fighting anti-Semitism. And that's all going to take us about half hour at most, I hope a little bit less. And then I really want to open this up to your questions and comments. So please do put them in the chat, and Zoe is going to help us monitor those, and we're going to talk about it. So the first thing I want to talk about, and this is something I've professionally, as somebody who covers religion as a journalist, I am obligated to pay a lot of attention to, even though it's not one of my favorite topics, which is the current state of anti-Semitism in the United States and the world. This is a very, very fraught topic, largely because there are a lot of people who don't want to speak about it. And the kind of people who don't want to speak about it come in every shape, size, variety, flavor that there is, right? There are people who don't want to talk about anti-Semitism because it's an unpleasant topic. I count myself there, right? It's not fun dinner table conversation. There are people who want to deny its existence or kind of recent rise, alas, in the United States, because they feel there's a kind of conservative or right-wing denialism that says the United States is the land of the free and the home of the brave, and it's perfect and it's terrific, and if you don't love it, leave it, and it's a great welcoming place. And to talk about anti-Semitism somehow denies the greatness of this country, which I think is not the right way to look at it. And then there's a kind of left-wing denialism that says, why would we talk about anti-Semitism when there are so many other, and they would say more pressing concerns, and there are people who are more marginalized than the Jews, other ethnic and minority and marginalized groups. And they would say to talk about anti-Semitism is really just to talk about privileged white people, they would say, who, when we should be talking about more pressing social justice concerns. And I understand both of these critiques from the left and the right, that anti-Semitism is not something that we should be spending a lot of time on, right? Because it denies the greatness of the country, the oppression of other groups, and so forth and so on. I understand these critiques. I don't want to make light of them. But I think they're misguided. I think they're misguided for two fundamental reasons. The first is that, and I say this as a journalist, as someone who thinks first and foremost as I've been a college professor, I've been a journalist, a writer. I hate the term public intellectual because it sounds arrogant, but when you have a lot of different freelance tax forms that come every year, it kind of means you're a public intellectual. Like when your accountant is weighed down with, are they W-2s? Like when you have 20 W-2s, that means you're just not gainfully employed with one job, so you must be a public intellectual. And when you do that work, essentially what you're selling is your commitment to the truth. I mean, what you're selling to editors who publish you, what you're selling to audiences who come and hear me give talks, and I do a lot of public speaking to groups like you. When you're selling an op-ed to the New York Times, when I ran one just this last Sunday about George Santos, the congressman from New York, what you're selling is, I will spot truths and I will tell them even when they're uncomfortable. That's the job. That's fundamentally all you have going for you. And anti-Semitism and its reality is a truth. It's a truth we're not at liberty to ignore. Reality is that which we're not at liberty to ignore. Reality smacks you in the face. And there is always anti-Semitism present. And this is part two of why these critiques that tell us to ignore it are misguided. It has gone up in the past 5 years or so in the United States. There is empirical proof. There are reasons to believe it has gone up. The two major organizations that track hate crimes in the United States, one being the Anti-Defamation League, the other being the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, have both shown in their statistics, and these statistics are not perfect, they're imperfect, and each of them has a different methodology that has its own strengths and weaknesses. But nevertheless, they are two organizations that do pretty rigorous tracking of hate crimes. And in both cases, they have shown a pretty strong uptick in the past 5 years in hate crimes targeted against Jews. And that is true whether you are looking at the broadest numbers that they give that include not only physical attacks, but also people hurling slurs from a passing car window. It is true whether you include or exclude versions of anti-Zionism that some people feel veer into anti-Semitism. Even if you exclude those and say, well, we're not going to talk about that, we're just going to talk about people, committing actual physical violence or using really obvious anti-Semitic slurs and caricatures. However you count the numbers, it is still the case that whatever you're looking at, it has gone up in the last 5 years. And I have a pretty strong belief that the increased prevalence of it is in fact undercounted. I think that We know anecdotally that, for example, in the past couple years, really since about 2020, in Brooklyn, in the ultra-Orthodox communities, there has been a nearly daily barrage of anti-Semitic incidents. Some of them quite physically violent, people being hit, punched, their yarmulkes or hats knocked from their heads, people being attacked, robbed, beaten while anti-Semitic slurs are being shouted at them. I mean, there has been a fairly consistent drumbeat, and that's a community that doesn't always report crimes to the secular municipal police as much as they ought, for reasons that other marginalized groups often don't report crimes to the police as much as they ought, because they often feel they might not be taken seriously, or because they're so used to it, they see it as such a fact of life that they that they kind of shrug at some of the incidents and don't report them all because they figure it's never going to go away. What's the use? Okay, so we have anecdotally and with more rigorous empirical studies a bunch of reasons to believe that anti-Semitism has actually gone up across the board. And then, of course, the other thing I'd point out is it's gone up not only in a kind of thuggish way, where you're talking about often under-resourced communities where poor Jews are living near poor non-Jews, and there often are physical altercations. I'm talking about Brooklyn, for example, but it's also gone up in the genteel settings of elite college campuses. I mean, there was a recent 5-year period where 3 different incidents of swastikas being painted on school property were found at Northwestern University in very beautiful, wealthy, lush Evanston, Illinois. You're talking about an elite liberal school in elite liberal setting, and swastikas, popping up. And then, of course, I probably don't have to tell all of you about the rising incidence of celebrities, often musical artists, athletes, and so forth, who are promulgating anti-Semitic stereotypes and slurs. So with all of this, the first thing I want you to know as grandparents is that if you have perceived that there's more anti-Semitism now than 5 or 10 years ago, you're correct. It might not be as bad as some people think it is. If you spent all day on Twitter following certain people, if you were in a kind of 24-hour news cycle or social media hothouse, you might think it's 1,000 times worse than even it is, because there is a way in which certain forms of contemporary media, especially online media, tend to amplify the worst stuff in our society. So it might not be as bad as you think it is. But if you think it's getting bad, you are not entirely wrong. And so the first thing is to trust those instincts and to honor what you are seeing with your own eyes and what you're reading about. That's the first thing I want to talk about, which is, so as grandparents, right, you are absolutely entitled, and I think, in fact, invited in an age-appropriate way, depending on the age of your grandchildren, to talk about current events with them and to bring to bear history and historical knowledge that you have that even their parents might not. Let me give you an example from my own family. My father-in-law was a New York City public school teacher for 40 or 50 years. He grew up in New York City. He then went to City College. I mean, a classic sort of Jewish American story where he grew up in New York City, went to City College, served some time in the military in the late 50s, had a chemistry degree, ended up becoming a long-time and well-loved chemistry teacher at Seward Park High School on the Lower East Side, where he was from. And he is somebody who, as a longtime New York City teacher and member of the teachers union, lived through some of the anti-Semitism surrounding the Ocean Hill-Brownsville teachers strikes in, I want to say, 1968. Some of you, of course, will remember this, right? Now, this is a fairly specific thing that is not taught in high schools or even colleges today, unless you're taking a class on the history of anti-Semitism or maybe Black-Jewish relations, or if you're at one of the very few schools that teaches the history of the labor movement, you might not know about the teacher strike that was prompted in part by some very real incidents of anti-Semitism in Brooklyn in the late 1960s. But my father-in-law lived through it. He remembers it. He remembers all the key players, and he can talk about it with both an accuracy and a sense of real visceral memory that I certainly could not, having not even been born at the time. And that my wife, who was also from New York City and also went through the public schools, but had not yet been born, could not talk about, right? He has real memories, as he has memories of having himself been born in the 1930s. He's somewhat older. He has memories of finding out that the camps had been liberated. He remembers when the full force of what had happened with the destruction of European Jewry came home to America in news reports in the mid-1940s. He remembers the Rosenberg's execution in 1953. He remembers the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War. He has all of these actual memories, as do my mother-in-law and my parents, as do all of my children's grandparents, that my wife and I do not have. Our knowledge is textbook knowledge. Our knowledge is what we got from our high school history textbooks and maybe to some extent from colleges and universities. But they are very real resources, as you are very real resources for actual historical events that children's parents today, if they are, Gen Xers or Gen Yers, whatever, people born in, say, the 70s or 80s, don't have. It's not knowledge we have. So having authentic, actual conversations with grandchildren in which you happen to reminisce about stuff from your own life is a real and authentic thing, and a service as well that you can provide. So that's the first thing I want to say is, when it comes to the actual brass tacks of what anti-Semitism is, you have had experiences and memories that your children are not able to give to your grandchildren. They have lived through a different time with different kinds of experiences. I would also add here, for example, that by the time I was, alive really, and in conscious memory, there were almost no socially restricted country clubs left. There were almost no law firms that didn't have a Jewish partner. There were almost no communities that had real estate covenants or implicit real estate covenants that didn't allow Jews to move in. The world by the 1970s or 80s was radically different than the world of the 40s and 50s and early 1960s. There really is a change that comes about, a break in the late 1960s that you have a kind of before and after. So the fact is, if my children ask me, Dad, did you face any anti-Semitism growing up? The answer is a pretty clear no. But if they ask their grandparents, well, that's a really different answer. And so we're at a unique pivotal moment in time where I think grandparents can really play a role in educating children about some things that parents can't. And let me put a pin in that for a moment and drill down on it, because I was born in 1974. I think there's a very strong argument to be made that the 70s, 80s, and 90s, say my first 30 years, let's say 1974 to 2004, was about the least anti-Semitic time in American history. I mean, this was the period during which, right after all of the quotas at elite colleges had fallen. And I just produced a podcast about that, about the history of Jews in the Ivy League. It was the period when law firms opened up, country clubs opened up. I mean, basically, the 70s, 80s, and 90s was a period when Jews were being welcomed into the mainstream of American society more than ever before. We did not yet have the resurgent right-wing anti-Semitism of Charlottesville and we will not replace you and the kind of white nationalism of the past 10 years or so, nor did we have the rise of a different kind of anti-Semitism on the left. And it was also a period, by the way, when, in terms of our domestic politics, Israel seemed pretty calm, for better or for worse. I mean, the truth is that American Jews probably should have paid more attention to what was going on in Israel, for better and for worse, during that period, but they didn't. And there was a kind of generalized consensus in the United States that Israel was a good and easy friend and ally. And for example, if you were on a college campus when I was in the 1990s, you didn't sense much tumult around Israel, pro or con. All of which is to say that your children, right, people my age, in their, say, 30s or 40s, lived through a period of just an ideal period of not having to worry about anti-Semitism, about various forms of anti-Zionism, about the fights around it. It was an incredibly easy time to be Jewish. And that has not been true before. That wasn't true in your childhoods in the same way. And it's not true anymore. So this is my way of saying that people like me and my wife, who are 48 and 46 years old, or people 10 years younger having their first children who are in their 30s, are uniquely disabled on this question. We lived through a time when we just didn't have to think about anti-Semitism very much. And so when our kids ask us about it, we are kind of clueless. I mean, I'm not clueless because I do this stuff for a living, right? But I write about anti-Semitism. I write about the mass murder of Jews in a book. But in general, we don't have the same sort of memories and sense memories and visceral recall that you do. And so it's a moment in time when I think that grandparents play a particularly good role. Okay, so that's number one out of three. Number one, we are in a moment of real anti-Semitism, and you have special talents in terms of talking to grandchildren about it and just teaching them about it that your children may not have. But let me give you two other ways that I think that grandparents can play a specific role. One is that there's a lot of research now that shows that resilience in children depends to some extent on their sense of themselves as being part of a specific narrative. What do I mean by this? What I mean is that all of us desire to be part of something bigger, right? All of us, it's a basic human instinct to want to be part of a family that has made a difference, not just to be a sole actor, but to have parents who made a difference, and grandparents and great-grandparents. And similarly, we want those who come after us to make a difference. We want our children to leave a legacy and our grandchildren to leave a legacy and our great-grandchildren. And this is why humans, I shouldn't say Americans, this is why humans are so obsessed with genealogy, right? I mean, there's a sense in which genealogy is completely absurd. Who cares who your 4 times great aunt was? If she was a wonderful person, it doesn't make you wonderful. It's not carried in the DNA. And if she was a terrible person, that doesn't make you terrible, right? This is the sins of your great aunt are not visited upon you, nor are her virtues, right? And yet, as we know from Ancestry.com and MyHeritage.com and 23andMe, right? I know I'm saying words that all of you know. We are all curious to know if somebody in our distant past was great, or actually if someone in our distant past was terrible. It's the only thing cooler than being descended from, Rashi or Maimonides is being descended from, Jack the Ripper or, some sort of mass murderer, right? As long as it's more than 3 or 4 generations back, right? You don't want your grandparent to be a mass murderer, but 10 or 15 generations ago, it's kind of interesting, right? And that's because we all want to be part of an interesting, coherent narrative. I always joke that every Jew I know is descended from a chief rabbi of Vienna, right? Like you will never meet a Jew who doesn't have a grandparent who says that their grandparent or great-grandparent was the chief rabbi of something. Apparently Europe was just filled with chief rabbis. Everyone was the chief rabbi, right? And of course, this is nonsense. Most of these places didn't have chief rabbis. And if they did, trust me, it wasn't your ancestor. I'm the first to admit I don't think I was descended from any chief rabbis. But there is a basic human instinct there, which is to be part of an actual narrative of a coherent sense. And so there was a great article in the New York Times a few years ago by the writer Bruce Feiler, whom some of you might know. He wrote Walking the Bible, about how he realized that he had to give his children a sense not only of who he was as a dad, but who his parents were and who his grandparents were and who his great-grandparents were. And I think that's really important. And I think it's one of the gifts that I was given, that all of my grandparents told stories about who their people were and where they were from. And I sometimes worry that children, and I say this as a father of young children, don't get as many stories or as they used to. And I think there's some specific reasons for that. For one thing, it kind of cuts both ways. When we have really horrible people in our past, I think there's a sensitivity now that we don't want to burden our children with the sense that somehow they're descended from disreputable characters. We worry about intergenerational trauma, or we worry that it would hurt their self-esteem, or there are kind of reasons why we don't tend to talk about, great grandpa, the murderer, as much as we might have 50 or 75 years ago. Cutting the other way, I think sometimes we're reluctant to talk about the really glorious people in our past because it seems snobbish. I mean, we live in an age when everyone wants to seem very democratic and populist and all people are equal. And so I think there's an idea these days that talking about your lineage, your yichus, your breeding is somehow bad for kids. But I actually think that the opposite of both of these things is true. I think no matter who your children's ancestors were, I think they want to know about them. So, and that is something that grandparents are really uniquely positioned to do, not only because they know more of the family stories, but also because they have more time on their hands. I mean, the classic trope, certainly it's true in my own family, is that it's when people are in retirement that they really get obsessed with genealogy, right? I'm sure I'm talking to a few of you here. And so I think that the specialness, if you are a grandparent and you're spending some time with your 8 or 10 or 12-year-old, well, frankly, it could start at 3 or 4 or 5 years old, really, all the way up to a grandchild who may be in their 20s or 30s or 40s. If you have the opportunity to tell them, I learned something interesting about my bubby or my bubby's bubby or my bubby's bubby's bubby, right? That is, first of all, interesting knowledge. Most people are interested in those stories. And second of all, I think it is resiliency building knowledge. It is self-esteem building knowledge. There is research to show that we are intrinsically fortified and made more resilient by knowledge of where we came from, even if where we came from is that we are descended from ditch diggers and scullery maids. There is no shame in that, right? And I think especially in Judaism, where we do have this notion that all of us are B'Tselem Elohim, like all of us are in the image of God. And when we know, the rabbis of the Talmud, some of them are wealthy, right? Judah the Prince, who created the Mishnah, was a wealthy dude. But the Talmud rabbis all had day jobs, right? They were people who were, bakers and candlers and tailors and carpenters. They were working class people who also cherished the life of the mind. We live in a tradition where if what you have to tell your children is that you are descended from carpenters or primary school teachers, I'm just picking a couple episodes from my own past, that is an extraordinary heritage to give your grandchildren, right? I want my children to know that my grandpa, their great grandpa Walter, was a public school history teacher who earned money on the side as a carpenter. That is what he did. And his wife, my grandmother Rebecca, after whom my eldest daughter was named, was a primary school teacher. And I think that is as noble a profession as there is. I think it was as if they were princes or gedolim or great rabbis, right? And I think that if your grandchildren don't know all that you know about your own ancestry, you have a missed opportunity. And I want to tie that very directly back to the question of anti-Semitism, because I was recently asked, I don't even remember what panel I was on. I was talking, I get asked to do these wonderful interfaith panels. And one of the people I was talking to, I think he was a Christian and maybe there was a Muslim there. It was a great interfaith kind of thing. And somebody said to me, we were talking about what we wanted our children to believe as a result of their religious heritage. And I think the Christian was saying, well, I want my children to believe that Jesus Christ was their savior who was, crucified and on the third day resurrected and so forth and so on. And the Muslim said, I want my children to believe that, there was one God, Allah, and his prophet Muhammad, and so forth and so on. And I said, well, I want my children to believe in the wisdom of Torah, and I want my children to believe in the power of the legacy that they have. But fundamentally, something else I want them to believe, especially in these days of more anti-Semitism than there should be, is I want them to understand that they are aristocrats, that they are the heirs of 3,000 years of intergenerational book club, right? Of a community that for 3 millennia has been gathering weekly to read from 5 books, the 5 books of Moses, the Tanakh, and to keep this tradition alive, whether you're literate or illiterate, whether you are, look white or look of color, whether you're in East Africa or Persia or Europe or America or Latin America, that you are the heir to this tradition of keeping a particular, body of literature alive. And that is an aristocratic heritage that has been world defining. And I think that grandparents are really in a position to, again, by putting children in contact with their heritage, to make them feel part of something extraordinarily special. So then when the anti-Semites come for them in whatever way an anti-Semite might just with a small little microaggression or slur or dismissal of their identity might make them feel less than, there's then this memory that they're not less than.
So Mark, can I ask you a question?
I'm almost done, but yeah,
that?
Go ahead.
So the question that I have is that, and maybe you've already answered it, that you said early on, that all of us have had experiences with anti-Semitism, and I certainly have, in college and elsewhere. And I was wondering, based on that, in sharing those stories that we've experienced, what is the message that we should be thinking about imparting? And maybe you've answered that by saying, in spite of what others say, think about the beauty of your Jewish heritage.
Yeah.
That
well,
how many people do you know that dance around their books?
Yeah. Well, that's right. I think, and I'm actually about to this is actually, as I round the corner to my third and last point, this is very apposite, because what I was going to talk about is rituals and the power that grandparents have to transmit ritual. But let me dwell for a second on the way you phrased the question, which is, what do we want them to take away from that? I think the number one thing we want them to take away from that is, this is part of life. Jews were, the great Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg famously said, well, we're chosen, but chosen for what? And I think, part of it's possible what we were chosen for was an undue portion of the world's suffering. I mean, among other things, we were chosen to carry the Torah, right? We were chosen to make our descendants as numerous as the stars. We were also chosen to care for one another, and therefore to model chesed and loving kindness to the world. We were chosen to bear forth the message of ethical monotheism, the idea that you can't mistreat people just because you're in a different part of the world. That if my children shouldn't be beaten or robbed or raped, nobody's children should, because there's one God who has one message, right? Which is an extraordinary ethical insight. And therefore I'm responsible for injustice anywhere, because I know what justice is. And therefore, if there's somebody suffering it somewhere, that's an affront to my God, right? So we have all of these things that we are tasked with, right? But among other things is, Zadie also was tasked with having to deal with being rejected by an anti-Semitic fraternity in college in 1961. And then, of course, there's an honest discussion to be had about how do you handle that. I think it happens to be the case, and I did just finish producing this podcast about Jews in the Ivy League, largely at mid-century in the 50s and 60s. I was astounded at how little so many of the people I talked to cared. There was this extraordinary resilience in mid-century Jewry in the face of anti-Semitism, where they said, okay, this university doesn't want me, I'll go to that one. This fraternity doesn't want me, we'll start a Jewish fraternity. This law firm doesn't want me, I'll find a Jewish law firm, or I'll start my own. I mean, I don't want to make a virtue of sort of stoic, toughness, right? People have a right to be hurt and to be and to feel the wound of bigotry. At the same time, one of the responses we can have and should try to have when we can is defiance. And I think that most people I know in their 70s and 80s came of a generation where one of the kind of regnant responses was defiance. But look, the simple answer is that you have to tell them the story that's authentic to you, because knowing you better and being in relation to you will be a meaningful thing for them. If your story is, when I suffered anti-Semitism, it was at a hard time in my life and it contributed to my depression, and I ended up, dropping out of school for a time or being institutionalized, or, some key relationships fell apart, tell them that, because that's an authentic thing for them to hear from someone whom they love. I have one quick more little 4-minute bit, but Terry, you have your hand up. Did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, about what you've been describing is the grandparent talking sort of at the teen.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could give us some language, and we're getting a couple of questions about that. What do we actually specifically say to the teen that gives them ownership or agency in the situation?
Right. I mean, I think that so much of that depends on what they're coming to you with, right? There really are two sets of questions. Number one is, has this grandchild, this teen, experienced anti-Semitism, and are they talking to you about it? If they bring it up because they've experienced something, then of course you want to be a compassionate listener, and you want to say, how does it feel? Number two is, I think it's certainly worthwhile to say, what was your response? Did you have a response? And I would say the third thing is to give them, there may be specific things you can say, right? So if what they've been hearing at school is, well, the Jews control the banks and the media because someone on Twitter told them that, you may have very real stories about, well, in my generation, most Jews were poor, right? Or our parents were poor, that actually the norm in world Jewish history is actually poverty, not wealth. And so there are actual facts that you can give them. But I would say, the other thing you can give them is the long view, right? So if they are in a space or place in time in their lives when they feel burdened by anti-Semitism, they feel, I have a child who encountered a lot of anti-Semitism in one particular school she was in. Part of my job then as a parent is to say, well, could you make it 4 years in this school? Will you care? How badly would you feel if you did that 3 years from now, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now? There are things that we grin and bear because we feel in the grand scheme of things, they aren't going to be that destructive. There are things where we try to affect a change while we're there. And then there are things that are so hard that we say, I'm going to leave this situation. And I think that one thing grandparents offer is the vast picture, where you say, well, when I was 15, such and such happened. And by the time I was 16, I actually didn't care, or it was so terrible I left or whatever. So I think remembering the gifts that you have as someone who is older and has a grander sweep of history and the meaning of time is very important. I'm happy to take more specific questions in just a second, but I do want to finish one last thing, which is the power. David was saying we're people who dance around the book. Yes, and the last thing I wanted to talk about, besides the sense that you can give them a sense of coherent identity and narrative of who their ancestry was and who their descendants will be, and show them pictures and yearbooks. I mean, there's all sorts of things you can give them. But the last thing I want to talk about is the power of ritual. I will say, as a dad in his 40s with multiple children who works and my wife works, and we have 85 carpools going on, and each child has 7 different activities, and we have 2 dogs. We have 5 children and 2 dogs. So it's a chaotic household. I will say that sometimes the observance of Shavuos falls by the wayside. Let me be candid. So does the observance of Simchas Torah. So does I could list the list of good opportunities to do meaningful Judaism or Yiddishkeit that we fail to convert on, that we fail to embrace every year, is much longer than the list of holidays and opportunities that we dig into. In my household, we're very good on Hanukkah, because who's not good on Hanukkah? And we usually have a good Seder, either our house or someone else's. And then my wife comes from a family where, Purim was big, and they did Haman Tashin, and they did Shalach Manot, they did Purim Basket. So we got those, right? Do I also have a fantasy that my children would have a good Simchas Torah experience of dancing with the Torah? Yes, I do. Do I also wish that I was always making cheesecake for Shavuos? Yes, I do. The reality is that I'm dropping the ball on all sorts of potential fun opportunities all the time. And in my household, a lot of that slack, and I don't mean specifically Jewishly, I mean in life, a lot of the slack of fun is picked up by grandparents who sometimes have more time, sometimes have more money, more resources, more attention. And so I am sure, because grandparents are nothing if not shrewd judges of how their children are doing as parents, that when you look at your children and their parenting, you may notice things that they're failing to do or that they're missing that you wish your grandchildren had. And if there is one thing that you could pick, Jewishly, that you could give those grandchildren, your grandchildren, and I don't mean to assume that any of you is Orthodox or conservative or has this level of observance or that level of observance, but if you could find something in the Jewish calendar that your grandchildren aren't doing that you made yours, whether it was ice cream or cheesecake on Shavuos, whether it was making Haman Tashin for Purim, whether it was putting together their own, cut and paste Haggadah before Passover next year, whether it was even something your children do, but that you would do differently. If they do a night of Hanukkah at your house, maybe you're the one who makes the latkes or whatever, because your kids don't have time. There is inevitably something, no matter how observant your family or unobservant, that is being dropped or undersold on the Jewish calendar that could be an extremely fun thing with plenty of junk food and maybe presents and certainly quality time, that could be the thing the grandparents do. In my own life, with my grandparents, it was root beer floats. I mean, they weren't particularly religious people, but they always had Hires root beer and coffee ice cream, and they taught me that putting pretzels in ice cream is delicious, the salty and the sweet. And I joke a little bit, but you could add the fact that they took me to the theater and they took me to classical music, and they were in charge of all aspects of my cultural development that my parents weren't always there for, because my parents were busy making a living and raising 4 children. So that, fun, there is a fun grandparenting piece of this that gives you, because there is no better resistance to anti-Semitism than actually having a confident, joyful Judaism. And that's what I want to conclude with, right? That I do not think the fight against anti-Semitism is a lugubrious or depressing or despairing fight. We're not going to win. Anti-Semitism is not going away. It's not our job to make it go away. The resources we can give grandchildren are the resources of having a strong sense of intergenerational identity, buttressed by a strong sense that Judaism is joyful and fun and worthwhile. And those are things that grandparents can really do. So let me stop there. And I'm going to ask somebody else to look in the chat for some knockout questions.
Got it. We've got a bunch of questions, so perhaps you can respond fairly quickly.
Yes.
Barbara has asked that I read her question aloud. Others might like to unmute. Barbara asks, could you please address the specific question of how to differentiate between anti-Semitism and criticism of the current government of Israel and the treatment of Palestinians, Israeli Arabs, and non-Orthodox Jews? Barbara says it would also be helpful to recognize that a significant portion of Jewry are people of color, and their experiences are likely to be very different from those of us who are seen as white.
So that sounds like two questions.
I think the first is the question, specific questions distinguishing between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism.
Right. Let me take that one, and then we'll get on to other people. I'm happy to talk about Jews of color and that discussion as well. But let me start with giving Barbara one question. The classic case of this is a student comes home from college where they've been confronted with students who put them on the spot and say, well, as a Jew, what are your feelings about Israel? Do you understand that the Zionist state is oppressing Palestinian people of color and so forth? And this part of why we do go to college, I hope, is to have our political minds broadened, open, and to engage in debate and argue and learn and to learn ourselves and to teach others. So, one of the things I would say is, look, I'll tell you how I would answer that, because I don't really know how else to put this, to say, well, I think one thing a grandparent can do is say, look, I grew up closer to a time in the founding of the state of Israel, and you have to understand that for many, many decades, it was seen quite rightly as a place of last refuge for Jews, Holocaust survivors, people who've been expelled from Arab lands, people who weren't getting any support in their homeland, being oppressed in Russia or being oppressed in Ethiopia, that it was a place to go when most countries wouldn't. Most countries don't have an open border policy. You can't just go to the United States or Canada. You need to immigrate. And Israel's a place that says, if you're a Jew, we will grant your immigration application. So it was kind of an open borders question for a lot of history. And and then the other thing, of course, is that if you're interested in kind of the left perspective, that for many years it was one of the great socialist experiments in the world, and still has nationalized healthcare and all sorts of things that Americans wish they could have. So in many ways, it's been a model country. And then I might say to them, if after reading and studying questions about the partition and Palestinian treatment of Palestinians after that, you discover there are things you're really angry about with the Israeli government, that's fine. The important thing I would say you want your grandchildren to be able to distinguish is between people who don't like Israel and people who don't like Jews. And so one of the questions is, well, how are they making you feel as a Jew? Are they deploying questions about Israel to make you feel bad about being Jewish? Or are they deploying questions about Israel because they want to have a conversation? And it's often pretty easy to tell that. But I guess I would go back to the question of well, remember, you're a Jew just as so-and-so over there is Black, and so-and-so over there is of Latin ancestry, and so-and-so over there is, Polish. And the real question is, are you in this conversation respecting that person's heritage? And if they're not, if they're being casual or flippant about your heritage, that's a problem.
I think, Allie, I saw that you had a question about addressing anti-Semitism when your grandkids experience it in school. Do you want to say that out loud, or do you want me to read that from the chat? Would you be willing to unmute? So Allie said, my question is how to respond when the kids experience anti-Semitism at school. And part of that is wishing her son wishes his last name wasn't Jewish, so they won't suffer from anti-Semitism. So maybe in school situations, how do we address that?
That is so heartbreaking. None of my children has ever, I'm grateful that it would never occur to me that any of my children would come home and say, I wish my last name wasn't Oppenheimer. And what a painful thing that must be to hear. So the first thing I would say is, I'm so sorry that that's happened in your family, that anyone has been made to feel that way. I have so many questions that I won't hit you with now about, Where is that going on? That strikes me as a very unusual thing in America today. I'm pleased to report, but real nonetheless. So let me give two answers to that. And so much depends on how old the children are. There's so many important questions there. But let me give two answers. One is, I really do think that one of the things I talked about, which is building a strong sense of intergenerational identity to the point where they understand that, like all human beings, they have their own aristocracy that they should be proud of. You know, what does it mean to be, in your family's case, a Goldstein or a Leibowitz or a Kaplan or whatever you are? You do, in an ideal world, you want people to be so proud of who they are, whoever they are, that the idea that their name is some sort of badge of shame is completely nonsensical, right? Because who wouldn't want to be a Kaplan or an Oppenheimer or a Raphael or a Leibowitz or a Wolfson or whatever, right? So that's the first thing, right? Is, just, I was recently interviewing Stephen Rockefeller because of this research I was doing on the Ivy League. He was a Princeton alumnus. And this is Nelson Rockefeller's son. I mean, he's a great-great-grandson of the Rockefeller, right? You know that Stephen Rockefeller never, he might have wished his name wasn't Rockefeller because people probably wanted to borrow money or whatever, but he was never ashamed of that. He never felt it was a dirty name. He knows it strikes many people as aristocratic. And the goal, of course, is for every little Kaplan and Goldfarb and Leibowitz and Rubin to feel the same way. So that's number one, is you want them to understand the extraordinary gift they've been given of their heritage. But the other thing is, and so much depends on their own personality and how confident or extroverted they are, you might say to them, it is okay if someone is unkind to them to say, why would you treat me that way? You know, that made me feel terrible. Why did you say that? Or I think you owe me an apology. That was unkind. I mean, the same things that adults should say to each other when we mistreat each other are the things children should say to each other. Now, it might not go well, and frankly, it doesn't always go well with adults. But I do think that rather than say, well, let's march into the principal's office or, let's call their parents, the first thing you want to say is, have you tried making them understand how that makes you feel? Because some people are brought up short by that.
Thank you. Martin, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you, Terry. I was wondering if there was some generalities in terms of raising the topic. And here I'm thinking of not just necessarily with children or grandchildren, but in a structured setting, like a Hebrew school, where there's not a specific anti-Semitic experience or incident that we're building from. It's just that we want kids to be aware. We want to open the conversation, and we're looking for ways to do that in ways that will be meaningful, effective, and will lead into a valuable discussion.
So I think that's a wonderful question. I have a very specific answer I believe very strongly in, because I've thought about this a lot. When there's no specific incident on the table, the best education we can do is actually, again, as lay people, as grandparents, rather than high school principals, is just tell our stories, right? That if a child grows up having heard from grandpa, I was rejected by a Jewish fraternity, and having heard from grandma, I had some cousins who were survivors of the war, but some who weren't, and having heard from mom or dad, there was this one person who wouldn't date me in high school because I was Jewish. Like, having learned what their family has gone through by actually having had conversations, they are then aware of the world as it is. And then when something like that happens to them, they won't be completely dumbfounded, but also probably they won't think that this is going to happen to them all the time, because in America, it's probably not going to happen to them all the time. I think that whenever you make something part of a curriculum or a syllabus, what you're basically saying is, this is the stuff we're going to force feed you, and people will tune out. What you want is organic, authentic conversations between people who care about each other. So I would take it out of the schools, and as insofar as possible, take it off the schools and the syllabi and the curricula, and make it part of basic, human relations and storytelling.
Ricky, I saw that you had a great question to me in your direct message. Would you mind popping up and asking that?
Sure.
Awesome.
Most of my relationship with my long distance grandchildren is on FaceTime, which I don't have that many opportunities on a regular basis to interact with them. So do you have any ideas or suggestions about that sort of interaction?
How old are they?
The oldest one is 6th grade.
Okay, so 11 or 12. I think the big picture is that I want to emphasize that resilience to anti-Semitism is more than anything about finding being Jewish a positive and joyful thing, right? So certainly specific conversations about anti-Semitism come way after you've already found adequate time, if it's there, to laugh with them, tell stories of your week, hear stories of their week, tell stories, funny things that happened to you as a child. I mean, my children love hearing my mother tell stories of her childhood, most of which are probably not true. Don't any of you tell her I said that. My mom is an incredible fabulist. I'm not sure if these stories are true. My children believe every word of it. They love hearing about Henry Houston School in the Westmount area neighborhood of Philadelphia and my mother's years there. I mean, they love it, love it, love it. So I would say that actual conversation about anti-Semitism come way, 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 way down there. What they want to know is that they have a Jewish grandma who's led a full and beautiful and rewarding Jewish life, and that one of the great rewards is having them as grandchildren. I will offer one other thought, and this might be a place to put harder conversations, maybe about anti-Semitism you've seen, if it's been there. I would write them letters on pieces of paper, old-fashioned, what they now call snail mail, which we used to call mail. Everybody likes getting actual mail. It doesn't mean they'll write back. But that's okay. But I treasure every letter I ever got from the 3 of my 4 grandparents who wrote me actual letters. I still have them. It's a present. Who doesn't like getting an actual piece of physical mail? And it was also a place where I know my grandfather, who was not always the most emotive person, put some of the more painful stories that he had. And I think it is such a gift to grandchildren. I mean, the person grandchildren want to get mail from is their grandparent. It's not mom or dad who live with them, presumably, or live near them. They want emails and texts from their friends. But a weekly or monthly letter from a grandma or grandpa is a place where even if you take up difficult topics, it's still a gift to get it.
Thank you. Lovely. Our final question, and then I think we are going to close. We're at about coming up on 8 o'clock in a few minutes. Wendy has asked that I read her question because she has an unstable internet connection. Wendy asks, when is it time to go to the media after the police refuse to accept the crime as a hate crime?
Gosh, that's such a tough question. I would not place much stock in the media, and I say that as a member of the media. This is because we're hugely under-resourced. There are far, far fewer reporters than there used to be. This is all of our fault because we collectively stopped subscribing to newspapers and watching local news and supporting local news in any way, shape, or form. Old people as well as young people now just want free stuff on Facebook or Twitter. Like we don't pay for news anymore, so we don't get news. And that's a painful thing for me as a reporter. So that means there are very few, the Hartford Courant near where I live used to have probably 100 people covering Greater Hartford. It now has 2 or 3. Unless there's some extremely violent, emotionally or physically violent episode, or you have clear proof of it. You have a screenshot of the text from the high school principal calling someone a Jewish slur, whatever. Unless you have that kind of clear evidence or a clear narrative that you can show them, they're not going to cover something on your say-so. So I would not, going to the media hoping to drum up interest is a fool's errand. And I would, again, spend much more time sort of wondering about how is your beloved family person coping with it? What's their level of resilience? How can you hold them and hug them through this?
Makes total sense. Total sense. I think that with our deepest thanks to you, Mark, for your wonderful insights and for your vast experience on the subject. We thank you so much for being with us tonight. Everybody who's joined us, thank you very, very much for being here. We will follow up, as we always do, with the recording, which we're going to post in the next day or so, and with ways to be in touch with Mark, how you can buy his book. Thank you, Zoe, for helping us facilitate. Dr. Ron Wolfson, for introducing Mark. And Mark, again, thank you for sharing your time with us and your expertise. We so appreciate it. And to all of you, good night. Thank you for joining us.
Keep up the good work.